in film, television, and video game music.
Good morning, podcast listeners. This is your captain, Brendan speaking. You're listening to Behind The Cine, a BC Clark music podcast, and we have an awesome show for you guys today. But before we jump into that, we need to make sure that we go over an amazing release from this last weekend. Friday, March 12th, Lamb of God concert film was released. It is an amazing, amazing production. Blend between a musical, opera, and an oratorio. Music by Rob Gardner. Goes over the last week of Jesus Christ's life. Here, take a look at this.
Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us.
Wow, amazing, powerful stuff. I had the opportunity to see it the night before on the 11th, and I was in tears basically the entire time. So get your tickets, go see it. Music by Rob Gardner, amazing soloists as well, featuring Casey Elliott from Gentry, Catherine Thomas, Dallin Valbels, Taylor Morris, Joseph Hale, several other amazing, talented singers, and also featuring Nicole Pinnell on the cello. So go check it out, Lamb of God concert film. In the meantime, we have an amazing special episode for you today with several amazing guests and insights from some of the world's best, where we break down imposter syndrome today. You know, what is it? Where does it come from? And even more important, how can we combat it? So without further ado, on with the program. Have you ever started a new job, moved to a new city, or started dating a new partner and immediately begin thinking thoughts like, I'm so in over my head, or I'm not supposed to be here, I'm going to get discovered, I'm not good enough for this? Well, scientists have given this phenomenon the name imposter syndrome or imposter complex, and it can sometimes be devastating. It's led to those who follow in its direction into initiating forms of self-sabotage, ending relationships, careers, and even friendships. Research has shown that 7 in 10 people have admitted to feelings of imposter syndrome in their life, which means if you're listening to this podcast, you most likely have had a run-in or two with imposter syndrome. But what is it? Where does it come from? And how can we recognize it? Is it really that common? Can we eventually just get over it? And what are the possible outcomes if we don't learn more about it? Well, as I would when I have any other question, I went to the internet and I found something quite remarkable.
So I've experienced a lot of success in my life.
This is entrepreneur and business owner Mike Kennan Brooks. He started his own business, mostly motivated from the desire to not have to wear a suit to work every day. His business went on to win Entrepreneur of the Year award for all of Australia. There's no doubt that he's confident and successful. Or is there?
I still feel like I often don't know what I'm doing. I've felt that way for 15 years. Imposter syndrome is a feeling of being well out of your depth, yet already entrenched in the situation. Internally, you know you're not skilled enough, experienced enough, or qualified enough to justify being there, yet you are there, and you have to figure a way out because you can't just get out.
Wait, I thought successful people were always confident and experts in their field. Now, this may or may not be the case, but our brain is telling us that we don't belong here. And Mike isn't the only one that feels this way. Most successful entrepreneurs admit to feeling some form of imposter syndrome. So what exactly is this phenomenon? Where does it come from? And is it necessarily bad? Well, to find out, I went to a professional. Rachel, hi.
Hi.
Say hi to the listeners.
Hi, listeners.
This is Rachel Garner, and she is a mental health therapist in Kaysville, Utah. I really wanted to know what imposter syndrome was scientifically in the mind, and so I called her up and asked her a few questions.
Yeah, imposter syndrome's, I think, one of those things that exists for pretty much everyone, but we don't talk about it. I think it's a term that gets kind of brushed by the wayside. But imposter syndrome, at least, I mean, speaking from a therapeutic standpoint, is this idea that kind of these thoughts of like, who am I to get so personal with somebody else? Who am I to step on the ground of somebody else's sacred personal space? And if you kind of look up even just the definition of imposter, right? This is somebody who is kind of in disguise. There's somebody who shows up and they're not necessarily wanted.
Rachel says that imposter syndrome is the fear of being discovered and the feeling of imposing on others, that you aren't wanted. And for composers and musicians, feeling not wanted can be very problematic. So I wanted to know if imposter syndrome affects other established composers. And if so, then how?
It's great to have you.
So I reached out to one.
So Rachel, for the guests, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Rachel Robison. I'm a Utah-based composer, and trying to figure out how to introduce myself is like a really, really good segue into imposter syndrome, because it's like, how do I introduce myself?
Rachel Robison is a composer that has worked on short films, video games, and has been featured on podcasts, and leads the video game audio community here in Utah.
Refusing to accept your achievements and accomplishments in your own career because you feel like you don't deserve it, basically. So, you know, a lot, surprisingly, like, I actually don't know a single person that doesn't have some sort of imposter syndrome. And so for me as a composer, that really bleeds into like how I view the quality of my music and where I'm at in my career, because it's like I've done all these things like you said, and yet it's still difficult for me to view that as accomplishment.
Rachel goes further to say that it isn't even necessarily a conscious refusal, but it's almost automatic.
It's so weird. It's such a weird phenomenon, but like, you're kind of worried about the past and like what you've been doing to get to this point, but at the same time it affects your future because you're just kind of stuck here where you're at right now. And that's completely different from being mindful, of course, but it's like I can't move forward because I refuse to accept where I'm here. And it's not like refusing, you can't help it.
So, wait a minute. Imposter syndrome is a natural response?
If you're a human being and you have a brain, then we all suffer from what we call automatic negative thoughts. And automatic negative thoughts come to all of us. And so it's those little seeds of self-doubt that we plant within ourselves. It's that, who am I to help you? Who am I to share this? Who am I to be here with you? And unfortunately, our brain tends to lean more towards the negative side of things. And I think part of that's just socially how we're trained a little bit, right? As human beings, we're also kind of we're kind of a creature in a way. And so we have this fight or flight mode. And so our brains are actually trained to look for more negative things to perceive, is this a threat? Is this something I need to fight or flee from? And I think sometimes those automatic negative thoughts or feeling like an imposter is like, okay, this feels threatening to me, and it might feel threatening to you. And so it kind of feels like a awkward boundary. Like, do I cross this into you? You know?
So to recap so far, imposter syndrome is the automatic negative response from our brains when it senses that we may be crossing a boundary into dangerous territory. These responses end up manifesting themselves into depressive or non-motivational feelings like doubt, worry, hesitation, and even negative self-talk. But this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just our subconscious trying to protect us from harm. This second thought habit saves us from other real dangers. So the important skill that we need to try to discover now is how to combat those feelings.
And despite being a veteran of 200 television commercials and 2 or 3 feature films at that point, there wasn't a week that went by at ILM when I wasn't like messing something up and working on something and thinking, someone's going to come over and tell me to go home.
That voice you hear is the voice of Adam Savage, Mythbuster and practical effects extraordinaire.
Do you experience it? Yes, I experience it. And yes, we should all be talking about it.
Adam has a YouTube channel called Adam Savage's Tested, and he was answering questions when somebody asked him if he had experienced imposter syndrome. His response is really rather inspiring.
Because we got to normalize that stuff. We got to be able to talk about it with each other. And it's okay. It's okay that you have that feeling. It doesn't mean that it's the truth. That's not your personality. That isn't you. That is an opinion some part of you has at this moment based on some emotional data about what you're doing. And the way I'm talking about it right now, from this like meta level of sort of looking at yourself from a wider lens, is how I deal with that feeling. Everybody in a creative field feels that way at times. I don't think anybody escapes from that feeling. I had lunch about a decade ago with a good friend and was talking about imposter complex, and he's my age, and he said, what's imposter complex? And I was like, really, you don't know? Okay. And I laid it out for him. And as I told him, he like turned sheet white and he was like, oh, I thought it was only me. And I was so grateful to be able to welcome him into the club and let him know that he wasn't alone. You are not alone. Everybody deals with it. It will pass. Keep on building your skills. Those feelings, those opinions you have about yourself, they're not real. They're just temporary.
So according to Adam, it's not a warning mechanism for the unworthy, but it's present with everybody. Nobody is immune to the imposter complex. And what did our established composer have to say about getting over it?
Like another part of imposter syndrome is just like there's like this fear of like, oh, everyone's gonna find out that I'm not actually this good, or as my career progresses, like they're gonna find out and then
You're gonna get
I'm going
discovered.
to be an imposter. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it really helps me to just like keep in mind that it's not a race and it's not a competition, and my career is my own. So wherever all my friends are at with theirs, that's great, that's fantastic, but there's no standard of where I'm supposed to be right now. There's no chart like that I just follow to show like, okay, there's like, once you get to this point, then you're not an imposter anymore. Like, it's never been like that at all. So I also try to remember that, and that helps me of just my career, my personal journey is exactly that. It's a personal journey, and luckily I have friends I've made along the way that support me in that, and they, through hyping me up, kind of break that imposter syndrome and help me do that.
Rachel and I emphasized in our conversation that you, as a musician and composer, have the luxury of being individualistic. Your career field celebrates your individuality. So if your journey looks different from everybody else's, that's actually something to be proud of.
It's comforting to know that it's not just you.
Now, there's just one question that remained unanswered. Why is this such a big topic among creatives and musicians? Well, Rachel Garner had some amazing insight into why this is the case.
And I think, Brennan, just as I was thinking about your podcast and, creating music, it very similarly falls along those lines as well, where it's like, I'm here and I'm creating something and I'm trying to be vulnerable with you. And it feels like we're imposing what we're creating. It feels like we're imposing what we're trying to share. When in reality, it's I'm choosing to be vulnerable and I'm sharing something personal. And so trying to see it as I'm sharing this with you. I'm sharing this space with you.
How many times have we opened up and been vulnerable in our performance and creativity? Is it possible that negative and depressive responses come from us protecting the more vulnerable parts of our mind and heart? And being vulnerable has been culturally perceived as weakness, when it's a strength to be able to open up and see and feel as things really are. And that's what makes good music so satisfying, is it breaches beyond the realms of cognitive understanding and into reality and truth. So time for the final recap. Imposter syndrome, or imposter complex, is a natural response to us moving into unfamiliar territory. And almost everybody deals with it at one point or another along the way. Remember, imposter syndrome is an indicator that you've moved toward your goal and away from your comfort zone. The most effective way to combat imposter syndrome is the way that you remind yourself of what you've done, are currently doing, and are moving forward. It's a completely normal part of growing into your potential. The mantra that gets me through my imposter complex is the phrase, imagine how much farther you'll be able to go as soon as you remove the weight that you voluntarily carry. Remember, your circle believes in you, your mentors believe in you, your instructors, peers, teams, and fans believe in you. Remove the weight of self-doubt and negative self-talk from your back and run resistance-free toward the person you're capable of becoming. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you share it with your friends, and be sure to give us a rating. How do you deal with imposter syndrome? Send us an email at mailbox@bcclarkmusic.com, and be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter so you don't miss on extras and opportunities to participate in future shows.